Hello and welcome to Double Feature Reviews. I'm Libby.
I'm David.
And today we're going to be discussing M and Taxi Driver. M is maybe an iconic film name, but it does make it difficult to search on Wikipedia, IMDb. No one has respect for the classics anymore, David.
It's not. It does not pass the Google test. You bring that to your marketing department and you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, the 1931 production company needed to prioritize SEO way more.
That's right. It was not very forward thinking of them. This is maybe our most acclaimed episode. You know, these are two historic films in the canon of great cinema.
I mean, I think our triple feature might match, but only because there's three
That's
movies. Fair. The Amadeus, Prestige, Black Swan, I think probably matches.
I think that basically checks out.
But for two movies, I think you're correct. So this is for all you film bros out there. Had you seen these movies before, David?
I had seen them both before.
I believe you.
I think I saw him maybe 10 years ago, and I've seen it once or twice since. And Taxi Driver, I'm pretty sure I've only seen it twice, but I remember both of those experiences very clearly. I saw it first when I was probably 11 or so, and then again when I was in college.
Yeah, I hadn't seen either of these movies before, but I knew a fair amount about them just through cultural osmosis.
I was a pretty big Martin Scorsese fan from age 10 to age 15, so most of the Martin Scorseses were watched in that period.
What is your favorite Scorsese?
I would maybe say The Wolf of Wall Street. I think The Wolf of Wall Street is a great movie. Great movie.
I know you didn't watch Age of Innocence in that time because we watched it together. That's maybe true. 5 years ago.
That one. I think we might do Wolf of Wall Street maybe at some point on the podcast. Not sure about Age of Innocence. Maybe if you really want to.
It does have Richard E. Grant in it.
That's why it's tempting. It's tempting.
So no pressure, given that these are the most acclaimed films we've done yet. But what would you title this double feature? So it's 2025. Welcome to the new year. A little refresher. We treat our double features and once a year triple features like a film studies class, like a one lecture or 1 week focus in a college film studies class. And so what I'm asking David now is, on the syllabus for that class, what would this day be called? So like class 15 is called...
The Real Noir was inside us the whole time. The point, I think, fundamentally is that they're both crime action thrillers. And they play into the pulpy entertainment style that film noir is so commonly associated with. But though film noir also deals with very dark themes, these are much more heavily focused on internal psychological experience of characters as opposed to purely economic ways that a lot of film noirs are set. And I think there's kind of a way to interpret it for the two films differently. I mean, because they, in a way, sort of bookend the noir genre in the history of film, where this film helped to establish this darker... M helped to establish this darker tone and more serious and more thoughtful tone that noir came to be known for. And in fact, one of Fritz Lang's future films that was released in 1944 was part of the original slate of 4 or 5 films that were released in France that summer that became known as film noir. So not this work in particular, but Fritz Lang's works in general really established and helped a lot to found this genre. And on the other hand, we see Taxi Driver, which helps to mark the end of film noir as a way to approach these dark themes and crime stories that audiences felt were sort of legitimate and were sort of honest about the human experience. Because after this film, there was a big shift to, no, we really need to look at these less as just stories about crime or stories about dark themes and to deep psychological studies of the culprits.
Yeah, I had seen your title before I thought of mine, which I think is good because I think I would have gone for something very similar. Yours is definitely better than mine. So I fell back on the reliable tactic of using a question. So the question that these films ask and answer in different ways is, why can't I be bad?
I like that.
We'll get more into that as we talk about the films because both of those really come up at the end of the films.
Yes.
And for people who haven't seen these movies before, David, can you give them an idea of what's going on?
Okay, so for a quick one-sentence summary, M is a social crime thriller where Berlin is overtaken by panic and paranoia as the police and the underworld race to catch a child murderer.
Is the city ever firmly established as Berlin?
It's definitely made in Berlin, and I think anyone that lived in Berlin would really recognize the city for what they're seeing. So I don't know if it says that.
I don't think they say Berlin at any point.
That's a fair point. It's a fair point. And for Taxi Driver, it's a psychological action drama. A naive and world-weary taxi driver succumbs to violent fantasies as he attempts to rescue a teenage prostitute.
And to start our discussion on M, this is a 1931 film directed by Fritz Lang and written by Fritz Lang, Thea Harbu, and Egon Jakobsson. It stars Peter Lorre as Hans Beckert, Otto Wernicke as Karl Lohmann, Gustav Gründgens as Der Schranker, Friedrich Nass as Franz, and Georg John as the blind panhandler. I didn't say that right. As the blind pan... It's hard to do the D on blind and then not do a D on pan, and then do a D on handler. The blind pan handler.
So M came about largely because Fritz Lang wanted to make a much more serious, grounded story after his two previous big projects, Metropolis and Woman in the Moon, were kind of considered critical and commercial failures. Much bigger, more imaginistic fantasies. Of course, both of these movies are now very acclaimed, and Metropolis is considered one of the greatest movies of all time. But they weren't received that well at that time, partially due to bad editing that Fritz Lang couldn't control. So in 1930, he announced he was going to make a new project, Murderer Among Us, and immediately the project was banned by the Nazis. Because so much of what is going on in the story and in the story of M getting created is influenced by what's happening in real life in Berlin at this time. We talked about this in our Cabaret episode.
Because you've all seen Cabaret.
Where Berlin was increasingly being controlled by gangs of violent Nazi thugs. And this wasn't just something that was happening on the street and in, dirty artistic bars. This was happening at the high levels of German industry as well.
Yeah, I think this is mostly a Berlin issue. At this point in 1930, I believe that the Nazi Party is still only the second largest party in the German parliament. Is that correct?
I don't know exactly at what point we are in the political rise to power, but I think the key point, like you said, is that what matters is that in the city of Berlin, the Nazis were not only a social threat, but a violent threat everywhere in life. And so the owner of the film studio that Fritz Lang had to work at was a member of the Nazi Party. And so even though the party wasn't necessarily leading the government, they decided that this movie wasn't getting made. And they didn't know anything about the movie. They just heard the title, Murderers Among Us, and they were like, those are Nazis. That's not a good sign for your brand when you immediately jump to that decision.
Oh, murderers. They're talking about us.
Yeah. So Fritz Lang had to sell to the studio head that it was not about the Nazis and the murderer was a child murderer. And
okay, so that was the original concept. He didn't change it after
that's right.
It got okay.
It's worth noting that the concept for the film and the script for the film is a co-production of Fritz Lang and his wife, and his wife also co-wrote Metropolis. I'm a little bit hesitant to remember and pronounce her name.
Thea.
Thank you so much, Libby. It's amazing to have a linguistic resource here for these moments. And his wife was a major creative force behind all these films, and also was an avowed member of the Nazi Party who went on to become a significant part of their artistic movement. So, Nazis were involved in parts of this movie in several different ways.
And also, Fritz Lang was Jewish, yes?
Fritz Lang was Jewish. Their relationship did not end up going great.
Yeah.
At the time that the movie was written, it's not clear that she was actively involved in Nazi ideology. That may have been something that happened later on in her life. So he had to convince the Nazis that it wasn't about them. And once they sort of realized that it was about how maybe vigilantism is a good thing, they were into the movie and they said, all right, let's really make this happen. So it was shot pretty quickly in 6 weeks. And I guess that's not that fast for that time in history. And a lot of technical work went into the production of the movie because this was in the very early days of sound film.
Yeah,
And
this is Lang's first sound film. So possibly another reason why he decided to go smaller and more realistic. I think trying to do a film like Metropolis with really early sound technology would have been a lot harder.
a very good point. And I think it's easy to underestimate just how much influence this movie has on all of sound film that follows from it. Because, frankly, if you watch a talkie movie from before this movie, you're probably not going to like it. You're probably going to find it very stale and staged. And after this movie, there's a very good chance if you watch a talkie movie, you're going to like it. Because the naturalism that was the basis for the shooting of the scenes and the dialogue, and also the way that external sound, multiple soundtracks being layered on top of each other, dramatic scenes where sound is cut out and it's replaced with the old silence. All of these techniques were invented by Fritz Lang in these movies. So much of what we like about watching sound movies is happening here on screen. Peter Lorre, who, of course, has received acclaim now for a century, basically, for this film. Before this was a comedic actor, and this was his first major dramatic role. The production of this movie is very famous for Fritz Lang's abusive cruelty to his actors, which he is famous for in all of his movies. And usually in every production, there's one or two stories where he intentionally makes his actors do something really harmful to them, partially an attempt perhaps to create better images on film, but not clearly. And in this case, the famous story is that in the final scene where Peter Lorre is trapped in a big industrial cellar, he was thrown down the stairs of this cellar dozens of times, very violently.
Only once for the film. It only happens once in the film.
As a matter of fact, this does not appear anywhere in the movie. There are no shots of Peter Lorre rolling down the stairs, falling. There's not even particularly.
There's a shot of him kind of being grabbed and pulled down the stairs, and there's a shot of him sort of like rolling on his back after having fallen down the stairs.
He's not really pushed down the stairs.
Okay.
That's not really something that happens in the movie. There's definitely a sense that it must happen. He is roughed around a lot in that scene. But this particular sequence does not appear in the film. Now, Peter Lorre does appear disheveled and roughed up a lot in the film, and I guess that kind of worked to help with that. In Metropolis, this is not a Metropolis review, but in Metropolis, of course, there's a big climactic scene where Maria, or fake Maria, is tied up to a stake and being more or less burned at the stake. And they used real fire. Speaking of sound, this is the first case of a leitmotif being used in cinema. Of course, it's a classic technique from theater and opera and all sorts of other things. And so here again, we see Lang establishing things that people really enjoy in superhero movies and other types of things in modern cinema.
And that's in the Hall of the Mountain King.
That's right, from Peer Gynt is Dutch. Is that a Dutch word?
Danish. I think it's Peer
me.
Gynt. It's
Peer Gynt,
a Ibsen play originally,
I
and then it was adapted. I actually don't know if the Hall of the Mountain King is like an operatic or a balletic adaptation, or if this was just a symphonic.
I've seen it listed as an opera.
I know Peer Gynt is an opera. I don't think from the Hall of the Mountain King, in the Hall of the Mountain King, is from the opera Peer Gynt. Sorry, it's not Danish. It's Norwegian. Okay, I looked it up. So Grieg wrote incidental music to go with Ibsen's play, Peer Gynt. So this music played during the dramatic performance of it, and then later an opera was written.
It's also one of the first cases of voiceover narration being used in a film.
Yeah, as we were watching it, there was a lot of stuff where I was like, I bet this is the first time someone's done this. Although there was one shot where I was like, wow, no one has ever done a shot from this angle before. And when everyone saw it, they decided we didn't need to do it again. Maybe we could have cut that one.
Which shot?
So it's of Lohman. He's talking on the phone. Things are kind of ramping up. This is maybe 2/3 of the way through. And for some reason, he's sitting, in a chair in front of a desk. For some reason, we shoot part of his phone conversation from about a foot in front of his feet. Just like up, I call it the crotch shot. It's just up his body at truly the least flattering angle. I don't know what the point of that shot was, and it looked bad. So not 100% winners for M.
Maybe a bit too innovative at that moment.
Only 99% winners.
Maybe the classic filmmakers were onto something with skipping that one. The film premiered in May of 1931 in Berlin. There's not a lot of information about the financials of this movie. How much did it cost? How much did it make? We don't know. It also did not get any awards attention because, not for the awards that we try to pay attention to, because the Oscars only existed for a couple years and there was no best foreign language feature or anything like that.
They were only doing American films?
This film was not, correct, and this film was not even really a major wide release in the United States. Certainly not in that year. And the BAFTAs didn't exist for decades, so no awards. It currently has a IMDb rating of 8.3 on 175,000 votes, so very respectable. And it has a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 100%.
Wow. Well done.
We did it. Talking about maybe the aftermath of the film, it's worth noting that shortly after this period, Nazis did take over Germany. I don't know if you've heard about that. And Peter Lorre and Fritz Lang were forced to flee because they were both Jewish. This film was also remade. After Fritz Lang fled Germany, he moved to the United States and became a successful and very well-respected Hollywood director. Made a lot of films, including films that had some of the same ideas that M had. In particular, there's a film, if you really like him, you might want to check out Fritz Lang's 1954 film, Fury, with Gene Kelly, which is also about vigilanteism and dark revenge.
And is part of that because M didn't have a wide release in the United States and also, no home video yet. So most people hadn't seen M. So he was like, I kind of have to remake it.
I think there's some truth to that. And I think it'd be maybe fair to Fritz Lang to go a bit deeper, which is that this was, for Fritz Lang, very much a passion project and something that really he felt like represented his ideals. And he felt like there was this continual risk of societies like the United States falling into the same type of evil that he saw in Germany.
You don't say.
And he was especially concerned about the rise of what we would now call McCarthyism and the anti-communist panic that was sweeping the United States. And other forms, lynching was also something that he felt like was representative of the same ideals. So he was very concerned about this, and I think he just wanted to push that message forward. And a lot of his films deal with these same issues. Last maybe production note would be that so much of why we like this movie, and so much of why it is fundamentally influential, even to modern movies, is because the copyright holder failed to properly maintain the copyright.
Yeah. And
so it lost copyright protection and went into the public domain, which is a good thing. And so it was able to be distributed widely, viewed widely, and the bad part of that is that means there are a lot of really bad prints of M out there. So, if you're going to watch M, even if you're not watching it exclusively through official sources, just take a second and make sure you're finding one with the right length and of one that looks like a good quality, because they do exist. They're easy to find, but there are bad prints out there.
There are some films from the 20s and 30s where the only prints that exist are bad. This is not the case. There are good-looking ones. So if you see one that looks very grainy, don't be like, oh, that's what it's supposed to look like. Find a crisp one.
It's also worth noting that the only prints that are available are in 1 by 1.9, basically square ratio, so that it has to be that way. It's because at the time sound was a new invention, and so the same film had to do sound and video, and it's a result of the process. So yes, it's supposed to be square.
So taking a big picture look at the film, one thing that I noticed that I think has not carried over into modern filmmaking is that this film does not have a 3-act structure. And I'm not really sure Taxi Driver does either. But we can talk about that when we get to Taxi Driver.
How do you mean? What's a 3-act structure? I do kind of know, but I think maybe it might be good to I know what you mean, but how do you mean?
So a 3-act structure is what almost all films and books, narrative works are using nowadays to sort of structure your story. If you go to a writing class for either novel or screen, they're going to tell you, like, here's the 3-act structure. Fill in your events to have a sort of reliably successful story arc. And
this is what audience want. This is maybe what they expect.
And also, it's harder to be bad. You can certainly make a bad 3-act film. And when I'm watching a movie that is really bad, one thing that I start paying really careful attention to the 3-act structure. I'm like, oh, okay, here's the break into the 3rd act.
But it sets you up for success. It's a natural, emotional journey for someone to go through while they're watching it.
You certainly can make non-3-act structure stories that will be good, but it's way easier to make something horrible if you're not following a 3-act structure. 3-act structure kind of gives you a floor.
And the 3 acts are...
They don't have standardized names, but it's sort of introduction, set the scene, set the status quo. You get some Joseph Campbellisms in here, so the hero will probably refuse a call to action. And the 3 acts don't have to all be the same length. Then the hero will be forced into action. That's when you start Act 2, which is when... Act 2 is often the longest act. It's when most of the story is happening and like the actual events. We've gotten through the setup and we can now see how the setup plays out. And then you have the break into the 3rd act, which normally involves some sort of big revelation. For protagonists, there may be a like want versus need dynamic going on. And a lot of times at the end of the 2nd act, the hero gets what they want. And that is when they realize that they do not have what they need, or they had been wanting the wrong thing all the time. And so the 3rd act is often like darker. The hero is at a low point. And they, in the end, hopefully get what they need if it's not a tragedy. And if it is a tragedy, then they don't, but they realize it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think these stories are designed, just like you're saying, to give people a sense of emotional fulfillment. That something has been resolved, the right boxes have been checked, the types of challenges that we expect on the typical problems, be they big or small, we've gone through those challenges, and now, for good or bad, we've come to some conclusion and we can kind of put this idea and let it go behind us. And I totally agree with you that M and Taxi Driver push in the total opposite direction.
Yeah.
And it's because in both cases, the director is trying to make us leave the film uncomfortable, unsatisfied, that there's a big problem, social and personal issues, that society is ignoring, and we need to actually pay attention to it. And that really is the message of both of these movies.
Yeah, we have to be the 3rd act.
Oh, I like that. Oh, that's good.
Maybe that should be I'm changing my title for the
that.
series. Who cares whether I can be bad or not? The real message is we are the 3rd act.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting how much Fritz Lang's motivation, in part, really was simple moralism. Like, I think one of the parts that... Obviously, the big message of this film is about the dangers of vigilantism, in some sense, paired with the necessity of vigilantism and how society is not prepared to deal with that question. And, this is not a political podcast. There's an anarchist reading of this story about how we can't really fully just trust the state to manage social affairs. But on the other hand, we can't trust ourselves to manage social affairs either.
It's almost like the state is just sort of made up of people.
Yeah. But it's also, I think, something that Fritz Lang really wanted to be the emphasis of this film that isn't picked up so much by later critics, is about how parents should pay really careful attention and supervise their children. He really believes this. This is the closing scene of the movie, and there's kind of some impression that either his wife, who was writing, Taya, writing the film, included that line as a bit more of a throwaway, or maybe even that he wanted that line in there, because to him, that was part of the real message of the story. I mean, it's worth noting that here we are in the 21st century, in a time where people letting their children run around unsupervised because there are child predators around is considered a terrible and totally irresponsible thing to do. So this is something he believed about really passionately.
I'll admit, sort of like 30 minutes into the film, when we're, der Kindermörder is out and about and everyone's trying to solve this problem. And we're seeing the destruction and inconvenience brought to regular citizens by this search. I was like, why are we not just like encircling the kids?
Yeah, I also agree with your analysis there about the structure. I think the film has a really interesting structure that I love, which is this outside-in structure. We start with sort of touring around the city, meeting different people. Yes, we realize we're watching one of the future victims. That's going to really push the narrative forward a lot. But we're also just sort of, there is no main character. We don't even meet really the main characters, except without realizing it, for the first 30 minutes of the movie.
At least,
if not more, yes. And over time, we start to settle in on some individuals and some issues. But I think, I'm curious, when you first started watching the movie, I guess, again, you're probably spoiled, did you realize it was going to become a character-driven story where we followed individuals around? Or did you think it was going to be continuing in this collage style?
Yeah, so I roughly knew what was going on in the film. I knew that Peter Lorre was the bad guy, so when we get that shot of him stretching his face in the mirror, I don't know how much that of a giveaway that was meant to be, because it's over the voiceover of someone describing the attitude of Der Kindermörder.
I think a lot of people who went to see this film in the 1930s knew that Peter Lorre was the bad guy too.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think we're meant to play.
I mean,
along with that.
he's marketed as the
Yeah.
protagonist, and when he's not, the leader of this gang or the leader of the police, we're like, well, there's only one main character left.
The most famous thing about this movie from the beginning was that Peter Lorre did a great job playing the bad guy. So people knew. People knew.
Okay, so this was his career transition
That's
away
right.
from goofy into serious.
Exactly.
Sorry, what was your original
My question was, did you think that the film was going to continue as this pastiche style, or did you know that the film had to actually become more character driven?
Actually, opposite. I thought we were going to end the pastiche section way earlier. I thought a lot more of the story was going to be about the trial. I thought he got an actual civil trial. Or criminal trial. So I thought that this whole second half of the movie was going to be more of a court procedural.
I see.
Which it was not.
Yeah. So we zoom in both in terms of the city. We sort of move into the city and establish individual characters that we're going to follow. And it does end up becoming much more of a procedural. And again, kind of helps to found the police procedural genre. This story and style of following the police as they go through their different techniques to find the criminals. I think it's underestimated how much this is a tech movie. There's tons of, you can see maybe the science fiction influence remaining here a little bit, where they love to talk about all the fingerprints and the different graphing tools the police are using to track the killer. In the big action scene, the bank heist scene, there's a big focus on how they have a central computer that controls the locks and operations of different doors. And this computer is connected with a network connection to the police headquarters. And
you have to time the keys to unlock them all at the right, or turn the key all at the right time, and you gotta follow the schedule. Yeah.
We really, again, helped to establish the techie heist Ocean's 11 genre a lot with this one sequence. And it really is, it's powerful, it's interesting. It's like a Soderbergh movie. Yeah, I think, again, part of the motivation of not going with this really satisfying structure is, I think you can tell part of what Fritz Lang is trying to do is just express his disgust with his own society. Because though maybe Fatty is our protagonist, I don't know. Do you think there's a protagonist in this movie? Do you think there's a...
Who is our protagonist?
Mr. Lohman, Fatty Lohman.
Oh, Carl?
Yes.
Does anyone call him Fatty?
Yes, he was introduced at the beginning of the movie. He's also based on a real German policeman who is known as Fatty. So yeah, he's Fatty.
I also know that this character, Carl Lohman, played by this actor, also appears in other Lang films.
I didn't know that, but that's very interesting.
He's in
is he in later Mabusas?
He's in the second Mabusa,
Okay,
Dr. Mabusa.
Okay, yes. Well, again, he's based on a real person, so that really does check out. Do you think this film has a protagonist?
Oh, yeah, I think Hans Beckert is the protagonist.
So you think the murderer is the main character, the protagonist? This is an anti-hero film?
I mean, the protagonist does not mean the good guy.
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't really a good guy. The whole point of the film is that there's these three groups, and we don't like any of them.
Right.
There are a very small number of good people, like the blind guy, Elsie and Elsie's mother. Possibly we could class the guy who actually marks Hans Beckert as M.
Sure.
As one of the...
He didn't do anything wrong on screen
He didn't
that
do
I
anything
saw.
wrong. He was trying to protect a girl from getting murdered.
That's right.
But our three main groups, Hans Beckert, the police, and the Nazis, are all pretty awful.
Yeah, and I think this is why we don't see that structure, because the real message is that Lang hates this country that he's living in, and he hates the society that's becoming, and there aren't any good guys. You know, a lot of the motivation, I think, is also because in this period, there is a lot of debate in Germany about capital punishment, and that's kind of a hot button issue. I think it's very notable that at the end, these, the criminals are partially there to serve as a substitute for the criminals, but also they are kind of a stand-in for the Nazis, it seemed like. The leader of the criminals, Schenker, he dresses kind of like a Nazi, actually. Kind of distinctly dresses like a Nazi.
Like classic, is it a leather trench coat? Or
it is a leather trench coat.
A waterproof trench coat?
A Hugo Boss trench coat. So he wears the boots, etc. And in the final scene where the child killer is eventually caught and they're gonna lynch him, more or less, his rhetoric for the egging on the lynch mob is explicitly referencing Nazi ideology. So, I mean, I think it's worth noting that...
Yeah. Do you know what his name means?
Schrenker?
Yeah.
I don't.
So Schrenker is a title. That's not...
Right,
he's
I know.
not using...
Der Schrenker.
He's der Schrenker.
Yeah.
German is non-rhotic.
Thank you.
Der.
Thank you.
It means the safecracker.
Okay. I don't see the Nazi illusion there in particular.
No, it's not.
Okay, he's the criminal.
He's sort of the inside man, the problem solver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, that's an effective literary device. Yeah, I mean, I think if you do want to watch this movie and you haven't seen it already, you might want to do a little bit of research into the German underworld of the 1930s, because it does expect you to be kind of conversant in these issues.
Yeah, I was initially confused when we were meeting our criminals, and I needed to ask you what was going on. I knew that at some point there were Nazi stand-ins who were going to show up, but I didn't realize it was those guys. I think a lot of that has to do with our translated subtitles.
Okay.
Were using the word union in context where that wasn't actually the correct translation. So they get introduced as like union members.
How do you pronounce this word, Libby?
It's German.
Yes.
Ringvereine.
Ringvereine. So they're translating as union, Ringvereine, which is a particular type of German criminal organization. So originally in the 19th century, they were unions. They were clubs for people who had recently been released from prison. And it was sort of like part of the reformatory process is that you were supposed to join one of these clubs, kind of like Alcoholic Anonymous for crime. Mm-hmm. Crime Anonymous. Shockingly,
a halfway house.
They didn't have houses, but they were clubs. Yes. Shockingly, these institutions ended up being largely controlled and influenced by criminals and becoming their own criminal organizations. And they were called ring clubs because you wore a special ring to show you were in the club. And they also became known as trainers for wrestling, mixed martial arts, as we would say nowadays. These were the MMA gyms. And so they were social clubs for people who used to be criminals and love fighting.
Yeah.
So whatever type of people would be in those clubs. So these clubs ended up becoming the most influential German organized crime families, organizations, whatever you want to call them. So that's what they mean by union.
Yeah, so I'm watching this movie and I'm like, eventually there's going to be something roughly about Nazis in here. And I get introduced to a bunch of union leaders and I'm like, oh, these are like the trade unionists. Eventually we're going to be... So I was very confused for much of the middle of the
they're not negotiating for salaries.
Yeah.
More like negotiating for shakedowns.
Yeah, and they were like hiding. They're very careful to like close all the blinds in the place where they're meeting. And I'm like, oh man, people were really cracking down on unions.
And I think, another thing that makes the movie really interesting is how effectively and entertainingly it documents the underworld scene. Mm-hmm. And that's something I think that we really see influencing later noirs. These scenes where we go to the underworld clubs and meet these people and see the women running around and yelling at each other. And the expressiveness and joy, that you can see in these moments. And sort of this idea of, at least people who are in this criminal world, they are being their authentic self in a way that other people don't have, is a theme that is really established to some extent in this movie.
Yeah, I think Fritz Lang would have loved it if Germany had had a prohibition like the United States, because the break into it's not exactly a brothel. I might call it a low-class introducing house.
Yes, that's right.
Initially, my brain goes to speakeasy, but of course you didn't need a speakeasy because booze was legal. That scene, I think, has been used for a lot of, as the model for a lot of speakeasy raid scenes in American films or films about America during the Prohibition.
There's usually one vice or another that we can use to fill this role. Yeah, I think if I had to come up with any media pairing for M, though I think Taxi Driver is a great pairing, if I had to come up with any pairing, I might pick The Wire. And part of what people are really attracted to in both of these stories is stories where the police and the criminals are sort of seen as equal forces. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to take a moralizing stance in a way either way, be it anti-criminal or countercultural. Yeah. But we're able to have this very naturalistic view where both sides are presented as good and bad in their own ways.
From a D&D perspective, it's a law versus chaos conflict, not a good versus evil conflict, which is, we might say, overdone. We've done a lot of good versus evil.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, I think you're right that Peter Lorre is the main character, and he's definitely not someone that we love or respect at all, but he is our protagonist. And I guess we'll talk about it more when we get to Taxi Driver, but these are two anti-hero films, and two of the most well-known and most obviously anti-hero films.
Yeah, and I think Hans Beckert, he's not exactly a charismatic anti-hero. He's not particularly good at expressing himself in a convincing way. But he's, in some ways, an alluring anti-hero. Some of this is Peter Lorre's babyface. He's got a very big eyes, very soft cheeks that make him seem both kind of like dismissible and non-threatening, but also uncanny and weird and
menacing almost.
Is there something, I wouldn't be scared about getting in a fight with this guy. Like, I wouldn't be worried that he would run up and punch me or try to steal my bag. But I'm still like, is it, what?
He's got the scary clown look.
Scary clown look, okay. I think the reason he comes off as not absolutely horrible is that these criminals are able to, like, undercut him in terms of horribleness. It wouldn't be that hard to imagine a world where he just easily is the baddest guy. He's murdering children. If you didn't also have this criminal network that is trying to do a murder in order to control the population, and also these police who are inconveniencing regular people and taking advantage of the populace's terror to really target petty criminals.
Yeah, I think that, obviously, the killers' crimes are way more horrible. They're less justifiable, but...
Which he admits.
Yeah. But you're right that we do have this really weird moment in the film where we switch to being team killer, which is a fun experience to be in a movie, because what the unions are threatening us all with is not the death of a few children, a truly horrible thing, but the death of thousands or millions of people living in a despotic society controlled by criminals. So it's this huge, massive social level threat, and we're forced to accept that social level threat is actually more scary to us than the personal level threat of a truly horrible crime that might not go properly punished. And, that's something that's hard for us as humans, as animals, to accept. We aren't used to living in a world where there are billions of humans all living together, and we live giant communities. We're used to, for thousands of years, millions of years, living in very small communities, where someone murdering a child was the number one thing that you should worry about. And organizing everything so that didn't happen, that would be everything should be sacrificed that way. But when we live in a globalized society, that stops being true. And so now we have to rewire the way we think about the world to appreciate that. And Fritz is forcing us to go through that transition.
Yeah, our monkey brains aren't as helpful anymore.
Yeah, I really like how the levels that the story is told in, its cinematography and its narrative kind of matches the levels of the themes of the story. It kind of starts as a crime horror, very pulpy, just about how it's a scary children murdering. Ooh, that's gross, but also kind of morbidly fascinating.
Spooky shadow.
And then it becomes this police procedural about, okay, no, we need to fix this. We need to, find the criminal. We'll go find him. And then it becomes this social commentary about how, wait, the police and the criminals are both doing the same things for kind of the same reasons, and some of those reasons are bad. And then it becomes an ideological philosophy.
And also they're knocking over anyone in their way.
And then it becomes this ideological discussion. We're really getting down to the core of the issue. We're drilling down into it, where we have this debate. It's a high school debate class about capital punishment. And then the film ends with this expressionist construction, which is just people almost flatly reacting to the world around them. And, the story is over. We've led to the conclusion, but now we just appreciate the images of people sitting there experiencing what's happening. So we go through an intellectual process that's guided by the multi-layered structure of the film. That's an amazing achievement in filmmaking.
Yeah, so we've said lots of nice things about this. There were two parts of this film that I didn't like, and I'm interested if you can recontextualize them for me to make me like them more. So one is that I don't think it makes any sense for Beckert to write that letter he writes to the newspapers. That doesn't seem consistent with his criminal ideology, and also it's very stupid to if you're trying to do a bunch of crimes, don't write someone a letter. It will only contain clues to who you are, and that is eventually how the police find him. Criminals who do write letters to the press about, like, ooh, look at all the crimes I'm doing, have a sort of self-aggrandizing, like, I'm smarter than you sort of ideology, or they want to be seen, they want people to fear them, so they want more people to know about them. That doesn't seem to be what's going on with Beckett at all. He's like, I have this compulsion to murder that I can't control and that I'm frankly afraid of. Why would that sort of person write a letter to the press?
Yeah, I think that is a fair point. And I think one way that we definitely could critique this is that it's not a amazingly informed criminological study of why and how serial killers or whoever we want to classify this type of person act. So that's fair.
I think it is sort of trying to be that at the end when he makes his speech.
That's true. I don't think it totally succeeds, or even generally necessarily succeeds as a high-level criminological study, even though that is some of its ambition.
Yeah, I believe that a lot of serial killers would do that, and for most of the film, it makes sense that would happen. But then when we actually get into Beckett's psychology, that it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't match. I agree with you. I do agree with you. I think if we asked Fritz Lang, I know what his answer would be. Okay. And his answer would be, it's because he wants to get caught.
Okay.
It's because, just like he says, he hates doing this, and he doesn't really want to do it, and this is the way that his subconscious is expressing this idea. I'm certain he'd give you that answer.
Okay.
You can decide if you think that's good storytelling or not, but that's what he'd say.
Easier ways to get caught, my man.
Part of the story is...
Well, especially because at the end, when he's arguing his case before the kangaroo court, he seems pretty confident, and the court, der Schranker, agrees with him that if he went before an actual legal court, he wouldn't even be sent to jail. He would be sent to, like, a mental institution where there would not be children for him to murder. So he knows that he could... remove himself from the situation that he's in where he is tempted to kill people. Yeah, the other thing I had an issue with is smaller. It's in the kangaroo court. It seemed like there are many times where the crowd gets like riled up and looks like they're going to tear him apart. And it seemed the crowd, I just felt like, was a little bit too under control than would be realistic. Like the way they're reacting is like people who are within seconds of pouncing.
I really do know what you mean, and it's almost sort of awkward and staged way that the crowd is moving back and forth. And I think there is a clear answer to this, which is this is a classic visual technique from silent film. And there's a much more emphasis of using very abstract, uniform movements of groups of people to express an idea in the story. So I think an audience member might look at this the way we look at like a weird... no, not the same message, but a weird Dutch angle shot where the camera is tilted at a weird angle diagonal to what we're supposed to be looking at. And how we kind of know that's meant to give a certain sense and a certain feel. And it's just kind of a traditional way of sending a message. And these types of crowd movements, exactly like you're describing, if you watch Metropolis, you're going to see a ton of that stuff. And at least he thought people were going to like it. So Fritz put more stuff of that in this movie too. So I think we can attribute that to the transition. That sequence
seemed more theatrical than the rest of the film. And now for Taxi Driver, this is a 1976 film directed by Martin Scorsese, written by Paul Schrader. It stars Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle, Sybil Shepherd as Betsy, Jodie Foster as Iris, Harvey Keitel as Sport, probably not the name that appears on his birth certificate.
Charlie is the character's real name.
Oh, okay.
He's called several other things in the movie, but his real name is Charlie.
Okay, IMDb lists him as Sport.
In the news articles that are briefly shown at the end, it is revealed that his real name is Charlie.
Well, you've watched this a lot, haven't you?
We'll get into it.
Peter Boyle as Wizard. Now, that definitely is the name on his birth certificate. Leonard Harris as Senator Charles Palantine. And Albert Brooks as Tom.
So, yeah, this is one of the most mythologized film productions of all time. This is up there with like The Wizard of Oz as a film that the most has been written and studied about its making. So we're going to have to get into it. We're going to have to get into it on this one. For the record, I've only seen the movie twice. So I don't know the movie.
Now 3 times?
3 times. You're right. Good point. So I take it all back. All right. I take it all back.
Now you have to be an expert.
Okay. You got me. All right. So this movie was written by Paul Schrader. He's the original creative force behind the movie. He's a film writer. He's written lots of other movies, mostly after this. American Gigolo is one that he's very well known for. He recently made the film First Reformed with
Ethan Hawke.
Ethan Hawke, thank you. So that guy. And he wrote the story largely inspired by his own life, where he lived as a disaffected Midwesterner. He was living in Los Angeles, but he was driving a taxi cab and not having a great time with his life. And so he wrote the story inspired by his own experience. He actually became obsessed with guns and had violent fantasies and all that stuff. Somewhat interestingly, he said he based the character of Jodie Foster based on the images
The character of Iris.
Sorry, thank you.
Jodie Foster is a real life
Jodie
person.
Foster's character, Iris, on images of smiling little girls that he would see in Coppertone ads on TV in the 1950s, including one Jodie Foster, who starred in Coppertone ads in the 1950s. So
She didn't even have to audition.
this is also one of the movies which is most heavily tied into citing other films and film history. And it is deeply cited and influenced by many, many other films after that. We really are now deep in the middle. You know, this is one of the founding movies of the film school movement, which is in the 1970s, after the film industry kind of in the 30s and 40s really becomes established as big money. Then they start, universities offer film studies programs. And somewhat to the surprise of people in the industry, the most talented directors are people who went to school and studied film theory in school and got a degree in it. They didn't really expect that to happen. They don't know how to make money in a movie. But it turns out those movies were really good.
David was holding a cigar when he said that right there.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate it.
They don't know how to make money in the pictures.
Exactly. So, Martin Scorsese is a classic example of this. Terrence Malick, to some extent, Steven Spielberg. These are all people who got started in the 1970s after kind of breaking in and going to film school. So this movie heavily references a lot of other movies. One movie that Paul Schrader said the story is based on and a lot of the cinematography is based on is a movie Pickpocket by Robert Bresson, about a guy who's kind of a smart street urchin pickpocket and ruins his life. That's actually based on an older noir from the 40s called Pick Up on South Street, which was like a...
Inspired by M?
It was a sort of leftist noir. The guy, J. Edgar Hoover, really didn't like the movie because
Oh, well done.
The bad guy, who's kind of the anti-hero, who is a pickpocket, he's always like, hey, you know, when people are like, hey, they're trying to fight the communists, and the communists are involved, and they're trying to steal a secret microfilm, and he's like, I don't care about communism, dude. That's like your problem. He says, are you waving the flag at me, man? And like, it's made in 1956, but he's kind of got some hippie energy that he's bringing to this character, and J. Edgar Hoover was not happy about that. So, yes, there's, I think, some connection happening there. And there are several shots in this movie that are, like, directly taken from Pickpocket. It's also really heavily influenced by a John Ford Western called The Searchers, where John Wayne plays a guy who's too racist even for Westerns in the 60s. So he's like, too racist, really? And it was kind of the first Western that in part was about how maybe Westerns are too racist. Also kind of not. It's kind of has its own problems with racism, which isn't that surprising for a film at that time. But took a much darker role and sort of started to show that these cowboy macho man guys, you probably wouldn't like them in real life. Yeah. They'd probably be like into killing women and people of other races for no reason, and they'd be really rude and unreasonable. So that might be bad, actually. Maybe this is bad. And so The Searchers sort of tells that story, and the plot of The Searchers about rescuing a young girl from sexual slavery is the plot of The Searchers and really mirrors it. It's also really heavily influenced by Abhijan, which is an amazing and really well acclaimed Indian movie made only a few years before, or about a decade before this, which is also about a disgraced soldier taxi driver who gets caught up in organized crime and tries to rescue a girl. So I kind of want to give credit to that, because a lot of people, when they talk about the influence of the movie, they don't want to talk about the movie that doesn't happen to be made in English. So that's had a huge influence on it. And finally, really influenced by A Bigger Splash, which is a gay interest documentary about David Hockney, the 1970s painter, and sort of the time between his two biggest movies. And here we get what we see a lot in Taxi Driver, which is this sort of frequent jumping around of the camera, where it fleets and refuses to sort of sit on any one moment. Kind of a technique that was used a lot in like modern reality television, of constantly just jumping from character to character.
Yeah, I noticed we didn't always follow the 15% rule.
A lot of the non-traditional...
15-degree rule.
A lot of the non-traditional cinematography that we do see in Taxi Driver is coming from A Bigger Splash and from Pickpocket, which also has its own potential gay subtext about how his desire is to reach into other men's pockets and other things like that.
Who knows what you find in there?
Indeed. So in Pickpocket, they had a lot of these things where we would zoom in really close on him doing these sort of balletic pickpocket moves. And another thing that was seen in Bigger Splash than we see in Taxi Driver, where we always are like zooming in on his camera, on his hand moving the lever of his taxi down, or the wheel, the number ticking over in his taxi, this highly focused thing. Again, we see that tons in movies, and it really wasn't until these couple movies that became a popular cinematographic technique. So, yeah, that's the film is very much rooted in film history.
Are you saving the staring into your drink, your bubbling drink bit for later, or did you want
to
include that there?
Okay, you got me. Yes, there's also a really classic shot in this movie that is worth, again, highlighting just how much it's integrated into film history. The scene where Travis stares into his glass of Alka-Seltzer and realizes he has to drink this truly disgusting drink so he can feel better, and just wants to give up on his life. And yes, this is a classic scene from cinema, the bubble shot, where your character goes out to an establishment and tries to have a nice time, and then they look at the bubbles in their drink and they realize that their life is just one more bubble in a drink about to pop, and what does anything even mean? It's maybe most explicitly quoting here 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her by Jean-Luc Godard, but it's a classic shot. It's way older than that. Quoted time and time again.
And normally it's like beer or a soft drink.
Right.
And this time it's Alka-Seltzer. Truly, man, you gotta be real sick for Alka-Seltzer to be worth it.
There was normally it's like the character is looking at a drink that they enjoy and realizing that this thing that they enjoy doesn't really truly make them happy. Now it's looking at something they don't enjoy and realizing there's nothing that makes them happy, and there's not going to be.
Yeah. So
this movie almost didn't get made. It was hard to get financing. It was considered extremely violent and disturbing, and there were a lot of busy people involved, and for a lot of times it was considered something that wasn't going to happen, even though Martin Scorsese was incredibly passionate about it and felt that he too, like Paul Schrader, kind of had lived a life as this character. And it wasn't until Robert De Niro won an Oscar for Godfather Part 2 that De Niro basically said, I want this movie to happen, and now he had enough juice to bring it to life. One of the things about this movie is that it's very low budget. It was filmed for less than $2 million, which is not a lot of money at the time. That's a very low budget movie for 1976. And part of that is because all of the actors did not get a lot of money. Robert De Niro was getting $500,000 offers. He did this movie for $35,000. And the same goes for Sybil Shepherd and a lot of other people. So this really was a passionate art project that people believed in. Less than $200,000 was spent on the entire cast budget for this movie, even though this has big names, lots of really famous people.
Is that why Martin Scorsese took a cameo?
No, Martin Scorsese took a cameo because George Romoli, who was hired to do it, got injured making The Farmer a more traditional action movie, and so he had to do it.
He was like, well, I'm here.
I think he was also like, I get that a lot of people don't want to play the most disgusting character of all time. I do understand that. This is my fault. I take responsibility for this, so I'll go down for it. I get it. Fun note.
When I watched that scene, I was like, is this him because he could not get anybody else to play this role?
Harvey Keitel was originally going to be playing the campaign worker, Betsy's boyfriend, but he said he wanted to play the pimp. Okay. And the pimp didn't look like Harvey Keitel in the script, and he only had 5 lines, and he really wasn't in the movie, but Keitel really believed in this role. And spoiler alert, Harvey Keitel is kind of my favorite actor. So,
okay.
I don't think he's the best actor. I'll list all the different attributes if you want.
He's just in all your favorite movies.
But he is if Harvey Keitel's in your movie, I'm going to watch the movie. A lot of this movie is actually improvised. Not improvised like they improvised it on the shot, but they did a lot of rehearsing and it evolved from the script. So, for example, when we talked about the campaign worker, his line, maybe the line of the movie, all of his lines were improvised. He's a comedian, and so
Albert Brooks.
So he wrote, my uncle is in jail for that. Well, not really jail. If I was living with his wife, anything would be jail. That's real Albert Brooks. So shout out to Albert Brooks. Love that line. You talking to me, of course, Robert De Niro's line. It's the number 10 movie quote of all time by American Film Institute. We all know that's really influential. People talk about it all the time. That was improvised.
So was the script, did the script not really have lines, or did they ignore the lines in the script and just sort of did their own thing?
So there were plenty of lines in the script.
Right.
In this case, the script said, Travis looks into the mirror and talks to himself.
Okay.
And I don't think Schrader was certain that we would necessarily be recording that dialogue or if it would be meaningful at all. I don't think Schrader had a particular ambition for that. He left that open. And from what I understand, Schrader was open and was involved with the film as it evolved, as it was being produced. So he was happy to see it mature in some ways.
And that scene was shot under stress. Martin Scorsese, they had gone over time. They didn't technically have their locations anymore. And Martin Scorsese was just, I believe he himself was holding the camera sort of crouched down at Robert De Niro's feet while a PA banged on the door every 5 minutes and was like, we have to leave. We are trespassing. And Martin was like, one more. Let's get it one more time.
It did work. I don't think you talking to me is an amazing line for the reasons that people think it is. To me, the reason I do believe that it is a great line is because he is talking to himself. He is talking to the mirror. And he is telling this person, I hate you. And I'm threatened by you. And I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. And you're threatening me. And I think in this moment, we actually are seeing Travis giving in to that self-annihilation fantasy that we see come up later in the movie. Yeah. That's my interpretation.
I also think it's interesting because nobody talks to him. Like, are you talking to me? He never has the opportunity to say that in real life because he's got his cabbie friends, but every other time a conversation starts, he's the one who starts.
No one cares about him, and that loneliness is what motivates his outlandish behavior.
Are you talking to me? Please talk to me.
Yeah. So, Robert De Niro did spend a month working 15-hour days driving a taxi cab in New York City in preparation for this role. And he says he was only recognized once the whole time, even though he had just won an Oscar. The one person who did recognize him was a struggling New York City actor who said, oh my God, you just won an Oscar and you're driving a taxi. It's this hard to get work, and had like a personal meltdown in the back of his taxi. So that's the only person that recognized him. This is going to shock you,
wow.
Libby. You're going to be shocked by this news, but...
Tell me.
Robert De Niro went full method for this production
to play
stayed
an
in
asshole,
character
to play a really toxic masculinity type of guy. No one else uses the method to do that.
I thought that would come as a big surprise to you. One of the things that I love in this movie, and I think really does make it great, and that is, I think, trademark of the film school movement, and sadly of the early film school movement, I think of Francis Ford Coppola a lot here, is how much the film drew from the real world around it to make the production. And partially because people were improvising things, but for example, there was a real garbage strike happening in New York City while the film was being... So much of the imagery in the film, they leaned into it, and they emphasized that more in the story and in the script because it was what's happening. Jodie Foster's...
So there wasn't normally that much trash on
There wasn't normally
streets.
that much trash. It all kind of worked out. Jodie Foster's character was already existed in the script, but ended up heavily being based on a real person, Garth Avery, who was a real teenage prostitute that Paul Schrader met in a bar in Los Angeles and said, you're now part of the production team for this movie, and became a key creative influence that helped them define the character. And several of the things that Jodie does are based on Garth. For example, there's a well-known part of the movie where they have breakfast and Jodie eats a sandwich of jam and a lot of sugar.
Gross.
The reason that Jodie does this is because Garth Avery was a heroin addict. And the eating a lot of sugar can help people with the pains of heroin withdrawal. So from this, we are supposed to understand that Iris is also a heroin user. So that I remember you had a strong reaction to that moment during the film.
Yeah, well, I mean, you also see Travis make his own breakfast, which also involves just pouring a whole bunch of sugar onto, I believe, bread and whiskey. Y'all, you gotta eat some protein in there.
Garth Avery does appear in this movie. She's the friend that's sort of shepherding Iris. She, the drum guy who's playing the drums.
Very greasy hair.
He's a real drum guy they just found in New York, and we're like, this guy. We got him. This guy. This is the guy. In the movie, we see a lot of Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood movie ads, and those are two people that are famous for really violent revenge, crime fantasy. The Dirty Harry and the action Charles Bronson. These are films that we're obviously commenting on how much this crime vengeance fantasy is not just something that Taxi Driver is doing. It's sort of saying, look, we're all in on this.
Well, and
together.
Travis dresses like a cowboy.
Partially, again, referencing The Searchers, because this is a Searchers remake.
But also meaning Travis maybe watches those movies. Is Travis a Clint Eastwood fan? I would believe it.
On the subject of food and interesting food choices, at one point, I'm sure you remember that Travis orders a slice of apple pie with melted cheese on top.
Disgusting.
This is a reference to a real serial killer, Ed Gein, who ordered this. This was his preferred.
That's how you tell. One, do they put a menacing shadow up over their own wanted poster? Two, slice of cheese on apple pie. Also, it's American cheese.
Oh, God, I hadn't thought about that.
You know it's not real good cheese.
I assume it was like Emmentaler or something that would kind of really pair with the...
David, you need to hang out in more New York City eateries.
Okay, I thought... So because this making up section, I know it's really long. Quick break. Let's play a quick game.
Jesus Christ.
Of wig or no wig. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a character. You tell me...
Am I allowed to look at pictures?
If you want. You're probably...
Okay,
whatever.
I've got IMDb open.
We're just going to do quick. So, Harvey Keitel, wig or no wig?
I mean, I feel like the obvious answer is wig, so I assume you're asking me this question because the answer is no wig. But that's... Yeah, I'm trying to remember what other Harvey Keitel movies were going on around this time, and if he would have had time to grow his hair out that long. I think that's pretty long to grow your hair out. So I'm going to go... And I also think that's a warmer brown than would be his natural hair color. So I'm going to say wig.
It's wig. Yeah, that's a wig.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I believe that that the wig almost deserves top supporting cast billing in this movie. Harvey Keitel had used...
I mean, I think they should just give an award to the hair person.
Good idea. Harvey Keitel had used this wig in a previous theater role, and when he did this role, so he based
he said, I got my own wig?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, he actually didn't have the wig, and he said, you need to buy this wig to me. I demand to use this wig in this role. And the costume department said, we can't afford this wig, and he had to go straight to Scorsese and said, I need extra money for this wig. His costume was based on a real pimp. There was a pimp in his neighborhood that he would see when he went in and out of his apartment. And so he would just go to the costume designer and tell them what the wig was wearing, and they gradually evolved the character to look exactly like this real person. And part of it was that wig. I think it does so much to make it interesting as a character. I also think it looks great. That's a great wig, and that's some top tier 70s hair.
You once did have hair somewhat like that, although you're naturally a bit curlier.
It wasn't quite that, but again, I started growing my hair out shortly after I saw this movie. So I don't know if it's quite that simple, but it's a great wig. It's a great wig. All right. Jodie Foster, wig or no wig?
Okay, I think she is sometimes wearing a wig and sometimes not wearing a wig.
The answer is no wig.
Okay.
That's all Jodie Foster. And there's definitely some treatment happening there. I really know what you mean. All right. Last one. Robert De Niro, wig or no wig?
It's got to be no wig.
The answer is wig.
Okay.
It's all wigs. The crew cut, that's a wig. The mohawk with the bald, that's a wig on that. Okay. It's wigs
so
on wigs on wigs.
He was clean shaven the whole time.
He had long hair the whole time.
Oh, he's wearing a skull cap. Oh, that's a very good skull cap.
He had to shoot the ending sequences, or the things that they shot at the end, he had to have the long hair for. So they had to skull cap him through all of those looks. So that's all wig. All right. So when the movie was about to be released, again, just about didn't get released. This is one of the most famous MPAA controversies. It was way too violent at the end, and they wanted them to cut it, and Scorsese said, I'm not cutting this movie. He had final cut, and he absolutely refused to do it. They didn't know what they were going to do. They're going to release it with X rating, and then no one makes any money, and etc. There's a story, it's a legend. It's not true that Scorsese was threatening to shoot and murder the MPAA people and had a Travis Bickle moment. He did joke about this on the night that Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma came over to his house and helped him figure out how to solve the problem. So it's based on a true story, but he didn't actually have a gun. He was high on Quaaludes.
He just briefly said, what if I just shot them all?
He said, I know the solution to this. I'm going to go get a gun and go shoot the MPAA people. And they were like, this is not the time. Okay, Martin, can we finish the movie, please? So
they're given Cabaret PG-13s, and they gave Cabaret PG.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I know what you mean.
And that was, what year was Cabaret?
72.
So 4 years from Cabaret, which is less violent than this.
That's true. It's definitely less violent.
4 years from Cabaret is okay for 13-year-olds to no to Taxi Driver.
So
We got a little conservative up in there.
the solution was that in the final sequence, and if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. It's the one where Travis walks in and starts shooting everybody. It's a extended and very, very graphic and very choreographed violent fantasy scene. And they desaturated all the colors. So it's not actually supposed to be sepia toned like that. It's supposed to be very bright and vibrant colors. And with like bright red blood and a bright red yellow in the background and a bright blue on the couch. And a lot of people who saw the original footage said it was some of the most beautiful and striking things that were ever shot. But they couldn't get it released. Martin's,
Okay. I actually think there is something about the color correction in those final sequences that makes the film way better. But go ahead.
That's very interesting because Martin Scorsese basically agrees with you.
Okay.
And he felt like once he figured this out, he was like, this is a perfect compromise.
Yeah.
And everybody can get what they want. So we'll come back to that. But Martin Scorsese is on Team U.
I'm curious if what Scorsese thinks is the same thing that I think, but we'll find
I don't
out.
know. He hasn't given a deep analysis
Okay.
of why he feels this way. So maybe we'll just assume that you're right. It was released, and it went on to become an incredible success. Mm-hmm. This movie was nominated for several Academy Awards and received good buzz. It didn't win any Academy Awards, but it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor, not Best Director, but Jodie Foster was nominated. It did well at the BAFTAs. It was nominated for Best Picture. Jodie Foster won. Bernard Herrmann was nominated for Best Score and won for the BAFTAs. It's worth noting that Bernard Herrmann died effectively during the production of this movie. He was very ill, and he was producing the final segments, and on the day that he finalized the sound, Christmas Eve, he died. So Bernard Herrmann worked himself to death completing this movie. That's what happened. Now, he was very old. He probably would not have lived much longer, but that is, in fact, what happened. And the film is dedicated to his memory. It's obviously been extremely culturally influential and critically well received. It's also extremely a financially successful movie. I think this is, again, something that really gets lost in the story. This Taxi Driver has a 8.2 rating on IMDb with 960,000 votes. So a very strong, good rating, a lot of votes. It has an 89% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Again, here we actually are seeing some of the initial reviews included, which were less positive. But I think that's actually pretty fair. There are a lot of people that don't actually enjoy this movie, and several criticisms have been made of it. This movie was produced for a $2 million budget, and its box office was $28.6 million. That's a 1,400% return on investment. This is the third movie after Black Swan and Sound of Music, which were more successful, to enter the 4-digit return on investment club, which is when you know this was a massive financial success. For its budget. So,
was this the first film school movie to get that kind of success?
No.
Okay.
Again, The Godfather, I think, would be the big coming out moment for the film school movement if we had to really pick one. But The Godfather was a much bigger budget than this, and had even bigger names than this did. Al Pacino could have been in this movie. He didn't want to do it. And it's currently ranked as 29, up from 31 on the Sight and Sound's greatest critics poll, and it's 12th on the director's poll. Let's talk about something that's bad. The film is most interesting as a historical document, because this film is the constitution of the incel movement, as we choose to call it now. And that was kind of the idea, that this was a film that was supposed to document these stories and to be a study of a character that cinema wasn't interested in talking about. It's clearly been very successful at that because so many people deeply identify with it. And, Paul Schrader says that he's regularly approached by people who say, how did you know about all the evil thoughts that I was having? And he's really scared by all these encounters. So this is something that happens to him a lot. And the way that the film dealt with racial and gender politics is, again, something intentional. Scorsese said that this was supposed to be his feminist film. It's about the evils and how macho thinking doesn't get you anywhere. That's not how a lot of people experience it. A lot of people experience it as a way to indulge in these types of fantasies. Interestingly, not just people who consider themselves severely mentally disturbed. There are a lot of people. Travis has become a sort of folk hero, a macho hero, and his devotion to macho ideals in a society where it doesn't make any sense is something that has inspired many other people to do the same on a purely philosophical level.
Yeah. Well, I'll say while I was watching it, we get that final sequence with him shooting everybody up. And Jodie Foster not really being happy about that. She's screaming and cowering in fear behind the sofa. And then the long shot back down the stairs of everyone he shot. I thought the film was going to end there. I was like, okay, and we end on Harvey Keitel's blood trickling down the stoop. Maybe, all the police showing up and, pan out. And then I thought that was going to be the end. But then we move on to Travis being heroicized by Iris's parents. And maybe Betsy thinks he's nice after all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially you're talking about the ending there. Much has been made about the fact that the film has a circular visual structure. So the music and the ambiance and the images that we're seeing as the film closes are the same that we see as the film opens. And Scorsese intended the message to be that society knows that Travises are out there, and we all just kind of ignore the problem. And it's just happening. It just keeps happening.
I would have believed if someone had told me that this was actually all supposed to be a dream, because those opening and closing shots sort of, not an actual dream that happens at night when you're asleep, but when you're just kind of spacing out on a long drive or while doing a repetitive job, which Travis is doing both of, you just sort of space out and your brain wanders.
I would compare this film to Vertigo in that part of what makes it work, if it's going to work for you, is understanding that the camera is not a totally reliable narrator. And we are looking at this story from Travis's perspective, someone who has in large part lost touch with reality. So it's entirely possible that a lot of these things aren't happening. I think the Martin Scorsese cameo scene is kind of a strong example of that, where it's entirely possible that this isn't actually happening to Travis, and we can't tell because these ideas have been so embedded into his own psyche. He has his own fantasies about killing women and black people, and how, it's not clear how much the events we're seeing are a reflection of those interviews or those events are driving the views. We really don't know, and in a way it doesn't matter. I think we could also compare it to something we've discussed on this podcast before, which is Camus' novel The Stranger. Another story about somebody who just sort of gives in to the desire to murder, in part driven by social issues that they're not interested in actually understanding.
And in part because they're bored.
Yeah. Paul Schrader has made very clear that Travis is intended to be a racist character, presenting a racist ideology that the movie is supposed to reject. But again, we see people from racist movements now finding an ally in Travis and holding him up as an example of their ideals.
You think they made Travis look too cool?
I think that there's definitely some truth to that. It's interesting. One part I don't know that the movie needs, and that is the gadgetry that Travis devises to work his various guns.
He's such a smart boy.
We don't really need this part.
Yeah, and he doesn't really use
They're not helpful.
Yeah, he just pulls out a gun from like a normal holster.
He does use his thing in the first shot where he shoots Harvey Keitel in the stomach. So, okay, it comes up, and perhaps we could say they gave him a quick draw. Keitel wasn't drawing. They didn't set it up right for that. But okay, go ahead.
So do you think the movie would be better or perhaps more helpful if we cut the letter from Iris's father saying, like, you did such a good job, you saved our girl?
Yeah, maybe that plot point could still be included. As you point out, Travis's ultimate lionization, maybe that could have still been part of the movie. But I don't think the film does a good job of critiquing that moment and really leaves it up for us as the audience to put the dots together about why this is disturbing, which I still think audience members do. Even the audience members, they know the film doesn't want them to celebrate this character. But yeah, I'll say that there's definitely a valid charge of exploitative and dangerously exploitative cinema here, because so much of the movie is about just experiencing those feelings in ways that are supposed to be entertaining. And it's indulgent in those moments. We just talked about in M about how the anti-hero story is something that, it was a period, this noir period, which we were kind of, again, I think, bookending with these two movies, where these characters were in some ways, the forefront of what was considered thoughtful and entertaining filmmaking and storytelling.
And I think both Hans Beckert and Travis Bickle, also Bickle, anything there? Are way worse. They're way more anti-heroes, and possibly even just bad guys who are the main character.
These are despicable people.
Yeah, than the typical noir lead who, is maybe kind of gruff, maybe a little quick to violence, maybe kind of rude, but normally is fighting for the forces of good, which these guys are not so much.
Or at least fighting for a sort of honest and fair criminal life, something that we can argue as noble. Whereas the whole point is that Travis sees himself as noble, but we, the audience, are supposed to see that is clearly not true in this case. Maybe there's not that much more to say about Taxi Driver, and that's fine. One thing I do think is worth saying is there is, I think, an important and good moral to Taxi Driver, and it's something that's shared in a deep way again with M, and that is the value of an intellectual life. And I think, as well as perhaps less interest from audiences and antiheroes, this moral about the value of intellectual life is another thing that I think is missing from a lot of modern media and cinema.
I think it's actually not exactly missing. I think it's more taken as read and thus not explored. Way more instances in historical media of heroes or protagonists who are not intelligent. So Morris by Ian Forster, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the main character Tess, not very intelligent. In the modern day, and I'm not sure when this started, maybe it started in the 70s, we really value intelligence as like the highest virtue.
That's right.
Like, I think it's better to praise intelligence than beauty, which is not something you can control and will inevitably disappear.
But we're living in the information age now.
And, So because we prize intelligence so much, if you want to have a successful piece of media, you have to make your lead intelligent. And so because that's obviously the case, and we're not contrasting it with any other sorts of characters that we're seeing, we're not exploring it as much. So I don't think Travis is smarter or more intellectual than the average movie protagonist nowadays, but I think the film is more interested in his intellectualism.
I do think there's a key difference, which is, I think the film wants us to conclude that Travis is actually a pretty intelligent person. He's a sharp guy. And he does a lot of dumb things and is in a great situation.
But it does seem kind of weird that he's working as a taxi driver. Like, he could be doing something else.
He clearly is a sharp person. He's very professional. He's very punctual. He has, some ways, terrible people skills, but in some ways, very good people skills. I think we're supposed to include that he's smart. But what he's not is an intellectual. And I think what this film is about how being smart is not enough. And how, in all sorts of ways, in his relationship with Betsy, he can't have a relationship with her because he doesn't have an intellectual life that he can use to have shared human experiences with other people.
He refuses to engage with her interests, which are political.
He knows that he takes her to a porn movie. This is, of course, maybe the most famous scene other than You Talking to Me in the whole movie, where he takes her to the porn movie. And it's partially because he wants it to be an erotic experience, but also, as he tells us very explicitly, it's because he doesn't really go to a lot of other movies. He doesn't know about other types. He knows they exist, and he says couples go to these movies all the time. And I love how when we walk in there, there's a couple sitting right there having a pretty good time. And that's one type of date. There's all sorts of types of dates.
Yeah, so I did have a slightly different interpretation of the scene because this is the one scene that I had seen before seeing the rest of the movie.
Oh, interesting.
I was doing a different project where I needed to get some clips of Sybil Shepherd. So I saw the very first one where he walks into her place of work.
That's right.
And then I saw this scene. And because I didn't have the rest of the context of the film, I didn't know when he was saying, I thought you might like this movie. Lots of couples go see this movie. Look, I can take you to other films. I wasn't sure if he was being genuine or manipulative.
Yeah.
And that he had intentionally taken her to see this dirty film, and now he was trying to pretend that he hadn't.
I think he's being 80% genuine and 20% manipulative. And I agree, it's maybe when you watch the movie that's more clear. It's a bit more ambiguous. I totally see it out of context. But yeah, that's partially a manipulative thing, clearly, but partially genuine for him. And, he's a lonely person and he's very frustrated. You know what he's not spending all day? He's not spending all day like reading books. He's not reading Camus or Sartre. Other people that
he's writing his own book with a crayon and very short sentences.
Yes. Other, the things that, for example, Paul Schrader did to escape what he's telling us is his own very similar experience, that he devoted himself to his intellectual life, and that was his savior. And I think that's really powerful. I believe in the power of intellectualism. I'm an intellectual, and I guess I'm willing to say that it's something I believe is worth. And maybe, we don't live in the most intellectual time in our society. I haven't been the first person to mention that. And part of that, there's a relationship between the fact that I think in modern cinema, having a character that's very intellectual, maybe it's boring, but it's also kind of considered insulting to the audience because the audience isn't probably intellectual. And are you telling me that everyday people need to improve in some way? This cannot be said in movies.
Yeah.
You can't.
When we saw Oppenheimer, one of the key things to notice about that is how little they talk about science. You don't have to understand science to understand Oppenheimer.
That's right.
Even though it's a physics movie.
But a movie that says that there is an intellectual lens to look at these personal issues, and that there's a lot of value in the practical elements of life and for your own personal psychological life to giving yourself a wide array of ideas to think about and to use as tools to explore ideas and connect with people. And I think that point is really powerfully made in this movie.
Yeah, so there's a scene that I was confused about that I'd like you to clarify for me. Towards the end, the speech that Palantine gives. Travis goes there with his whole gun setup. Seems like he's maybe going to shoot Palantine. He then does not and runs and goes and kills the Harvey Keitel and the other guy running the
There's three men that he kills, but you're right.
Did he chicken out? Did he realize he had gotten caught?
He realized he had gotten caught. So you're right. He shows up. He's going to do now's it. We're going to do the real assassination. Palantine comes off the stage, starts walking through the crowd. He finds his shot, is ready to pull and approach. When he puts his hands in his jacket, I believe, that's when security agents see him. The same tall security agent we had the banter with before says, that guy. The security agent rotates their body, so now he's in between him. He no longer has the shot. He tells one of his other agents to chase Travis. That security agent did a great job at protecting Palantine. They clearly did some reachers about how you do it.
They need those people in a Heathrow terminal.
I don't know the reference.
The Christmas movie.
From Love Actually.
Yeah.
From Love Actually, yeah. They needed that guy for Love Actually. Or maybe not. Love needed him not to be there. That's why the angel showed up to save him.
Rowan Atkinson murdered that man.
Now it makes sense.
Okay, so yeah, I wasn't...
No, he lost the shot.
I wasn't sure how to parse that scene, and I wasn't sure if he had chickened out, or was he not going to do an assassination?
I actually think, in a way, in
that case, I think that scene's kind of dumb.
Part of the point of the scene, which it makes very well, is that it's actually very hard to assassinate people. People act like it's really easy, and a lot of times people get away with it.
This is more realistic, but it is less of a story.
It's not actually that easy. And this is a moment where Travis's fantasy is forced to confront reality. And he is emasculated and made to feel impotent as a result of this, which motivates the extreme nature of his dash to save
So do
Iris.
you think he wasn't going to kill the pimps initially? Do you think he was
Oh, no.
His goal was to kill Palantine?
He would have been caught.
And when he failed...
I'm sure he thinks he would have been caught, either killed or captured at the
so he
scene.
had no plan to save Iris, and he was like,
That's right.
well, now that since I can't save Betsy...
Well, he wrote Iris a letter and said, sorry. He basically said goodbye. He said, sorry, I can't help you.
I interpreted that as you're going to lose your job because your boss is going to be dead.
There's this line, which, of course, earlier in the movie, part of we see his breakdown beginning is he starts lying to his parents and telling his parents that he's in the Secret Service. A bit of a classic plot point. So this idea, you can see it sort of morphing in his head because in his letter to Iris, he says, I'm going to have to go away for a while because I have to do something very important for the government. Now, this is a form of his lie to his parents, but it's also the truth. He is going to try to do something that's very important and involves the government, and that is killing the next president. So, of course, Palantine is supposed to be like a Kennedy. He's like a liberal politician, so he's supposed to be, this is obviously shortly after the assassination of the Kennedy brothers. He's going to go kill a Kennedy, and that's an important service he's doing for the government. So, no, I think he's quite confident that's what he's going to do.
Okay, when I heard that letter, I was like, oh, he's going to kill Iris's bosses because It's a lot easier to run away when your pimp is dead.
He wasn't planning on running away.
It was easier for Iris to run away when her pimp... I thought he was saying... And I don't think I knew what was going to happen in those final scenes.
I see.
I thought he was saying, I'm going to kill your boss, and that will enable you to run away.
Yeah, that I think it's clear that it's very much that he was planning on killing Palantine, planning on getting caught, and giving up on Iris. Okay. And it's partially because he's like, well, now I have the chance. It's a practical thing. And partially because he's like, well, I'm up to murder somebody. I got to murder somebody. I'll go. I got it. Plan B. Where's that guy with the hair? Do you guys remember his hair? That guy.
Okay, so what did Scorsese say he liked about his desaturated final sequence?
He has not said.
Oh, okay.
As I said before.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
I thought you were keeping it a secret.
No, I would love to.
Do you have an idea?
You're right. You tell me.
Do you have an idea or no?
Well, my guess is that, the point is that we are increasingly now very literally seeing this experience through Travis's eyes.
Okay.
And so this is partially an effect of the psychotic break that he's experiencing, partially the effect that now he is seeing himself in third person, and in a way that a sepia-toned photograph from the 1970s is a way that Travis, a mid-century Midwestern boy, would see the way that you look at someone else. And also that he is dying. And when you die, you lose saturation in your vision. Yeah. That is actually kind of a realistic thing. And so we're partially seeing his own visual experience. That's my interpretation.
Okay. Mine's actually completely different. So the thing I noticed about that sequence is that the blood is not blood-colored. It's brighter red. But the red that we ended up getting is Palantine red. Oh. That's the red, the color that the campaign uses. We see Palantine's name written in red over and over again. Sybil Shepherd, the first costume we see her in is all white. And it's before we know she works for Palantine. She's going into work, but she hasn't gotten there yet. That's when we see her. She's in her lovely, pristine, white goddess dress.
Very famous dress.
When she's working... she has a one that's a white shirt with a blue suit, but most of her outfits are white with red, intricate designs all over them. And when they go on their date, she's back to wearing all white. But when she's in the office, she's wearing white with Palantine red. And now some of that might be Betsy intentionally doing that to help promote the candidate she's working for. But also, I think it's like Travis is seeing it as Palantine's got his fingers on her.
Yeah, that's mine. Hands off. Right. I think that's an amazing interpretation. You're right. That's what I'm going with.
That's the only intelligent thought I had about Taxi Driver. So I'm glad it was sufficiently intelligent.
Yeah, I think maybe one question I am curious. So I'll state my opinion. I'm curious about your opinion. I think one thing that the film fails to do is use it. There's not enough stylization. Particularly in the cinematography. There's some of it. Again, we see the hand on the lever and the wheels turning over, the numbers turning over. Sometimes it's brought in.
You want to give it the Tarantino treatment?
Perfectly put. Yes. I want to give it the Tarantino treatment. And I feel like if this was, or maybe the Oliver Stone treatment, if this was, but Tarantino might even be more accurate. If this was Natural Born Killers, Oliver Stone's film that he directed based on the Tarantino script, or Kill Bill and was more in that style, not only would it be more palatable, but I think it would be clearer. I think it is kind of a hard movie to watch. It's not easy to follow if you haven't seen it several times and you aren't into the myth of it all. So it would be easier to see, it would be clearer, and also more accessible. And less focused on the purely forcing us to just sort of sit in this character's shoes and put our head in space where their head space is. But more filmmaking, where we are presented with the ideas and models that this character is using. And that might make it less just a thing about sympathizing. But this was what Taxi Driver sells it as. It's selling itself as, this is Pickpocket 2, The Dark One, where we're really going to focus on the actions that the characters take, and then we're going to zoom out and look at their characters in from the headspace. But we're really spending all the time in the headspace, and I think the film lacks for it. It'd be more entertaining.
Yeah, my main problem with Taxi Driver is that I spent most of the film not really understanding what was going on or what I was supposed to think of it.
I think this would be better with much bigger, bolder, highly stylized cinematography. And I actually think for the average filmgoer, it would be easier to understand its message.
Do you think it would be better in black and white?
That's interesting. I don't.
Like most noir.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you kind of have to make things clearer in black and white.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think what this film kind of stands out.
And noir, is, so heavily uses chiaroscuro, which this film doesn't. We kind of get a flat luminosity to every shot. And some shots are dark and some shots are light. Some shots are light. Some shots are light. But most shots have an even luminosity.
It is devoted to the idol of naturalism, which we've talked about elsewhere on the podcast about how, especially in the 70s when we see audiences want to move away from the modernist theatricality of the modernism that preceded it. It's very easy to appreciate this disgusting character and understand where they're coming from because it's supposed to really make us look and feel like we're experiencing these moments. It's supposed to look very real and not very heightened. So I don't want the film to move into some formal structure where it's intentionally black and white or, the camera can only be shown at certain angles or something like that. But I do want the film to take bigger steps to bring these psychological moments out. I wish the film did more visually to link his madness with a disconnect from reality. And to show that his way of behaving is not healthy. This is a sign that you can't process the world correctly anymore.
Yeah. And I think they do that at the very beginning and the very end. But we do it good for 2 minutes, and then there's 1 hour and 46 minutes of it being more pro Travis. So do you think we watch these movies in the right order?
Yeah. Again, they might both be most interesting as historical documents. You got to appreciate the beginning and the end of this process.
I think that's very strong. I will say, I think Taxi Driver might leave you feeling a little sleepy. And I don't think you're going to... the last 10 minutes is very high energy. Not the last 1 minute, but the last 10 minutes are overall of M are very high energy. So if this is an evening movie marathon and you're going to go to sleep after watching Taxi Driver, after watching your second movie, definitely make Taxi Driver second. I think that's what most people are doing. If you need to be able to go out and function in the world, maybe watch M second. Yeah,
I mean, I think I might actually say the opposite on that point because I think Taxi Driver is going to make you sad and it's going to make you feel kind of depressed and scared. And that might not be the feelings you want to have when you go to bed. And Taxi Driver is a night movie, but it's a movie about how weird and foreign and strange and uncomfortable the night is. So you can have that feeling pretty well during the day, and it might make you enjoy the night less. M is also mostly set at night, and the night sequences are where we have the big kind of fun action moments, and you might enjoy being awake at night. So I'll say if that's what you're doing, I'll actually say the opposite. I'll say Taxi Driver first.
So that's it for this episode. Next episode coming out in February. David, what are our films?
Up next is Marie Antoinette from 2006 and The Favorite from 2018.
We thought that would be different enough from these films.
All movies are great. We got to do them all. These are both two really good movies.
We don't have to do all of the movies, David. I want to make sure. We're not promising that. We're not promising to do every movie on this podcast.
I may have already signed. We can talk about it later.